Welcome to page 80 of Anatomy Coloring Book. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins. Today we learn about the cavities of the brain. There are holes in the middle of your brain. It's not all one solid mass. These holes are called ventricles. These cavities are called ventricles. We're going to learn how they developed during embryology when you were forming as an embryo and into a fetus. And in detail how those cavities remain today in the fully developed human brain, those ventricles. Recall in our lessons about the development of the brain, we start out as a single neural tube, or the nervous system does. Recall that it was folded, the membranes were folded over and sort of pinched into a circular tube. And that's this neural tube right here. Recall also that the tube started forming into the forebrain, which developed into the telencephalon, which would become the cerebrum, and the diencephalon, the mesencephalon, the midbrain, and then the spinal cord. And this is 4 weeks of development. And then note how the tube, as the brain grows, the brain is going to grow, is growing around here. The mass of the brain, the cerebral hemispheres. As it grows, as the brain begins to grow, the mass of the brain, it pulls these cavities out with it. So as the brain grows downward, the cavity grows downward with it. The brain goes outward and upward, it goes with it. As the matter and the mass of the brain grows from 4 weeks to 8 weeks and beyond. So that's what this diagram is showing. It's showing the growth of a simple neural tube and then the mass of brain growing around it and then pulling these cavities and forming these empty space ventricles, creating empty space in between, inside of the mass. So that's what this diagram is showing. In the fully developed brain, down here, we encounter well-defined ventricles. This is the lateral ventricle here. This is the left lateral ventricle. Up here is the right lateral ventricle. Of course, you know your terms. Posterior means behind, so in the back, this is the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle right here. This is the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle up here. And from a different perspective over here, and you can see the lateral ventricles are inside of this massive cerebral hemisphere. Again, these ventricles are cavities. They're empty spaces. Actually, they're not empty. They're filled with fluid. Fluid that circulates around your brain and spinal cord. That fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid. CSF. Cerebrospinal fluid. Here it is down here on the right. CSF. Now, so those are the lateral ventricles, ventricles 1 and 2. In the middle here, in the area of the thalamus, is the third ventricle. Right here, the third ventricle. It's in the center, in the area of the thalamus. And here it is again, right here. Third ventricle, the third cavity, the third space, open space in the brain. And again, right here, filled with fluid. While we're at it, here's the lateral ventricle. And the lateral ventricles right here from different views of the brain. Look like wings inside the brain. Empty spaces, actually spaces filled with fluid inside the brain. Note the thalamus of the brain, or the the hemispheres. Here's the the cerebral hemispheres here. Note the thalamus here on either side of the third ventricle. Now, running through this area of the brainstem, below the third ventricle here, there's a little tube called the cerebral aqueduct. There's no ventricle, there's no big open space there. In this area, it's simply a tube running through the brainstem. And that tube leads to and opens up to the fourth ventricle in the area of the pons and the medulla oblongata. You can see the cerebral aqueduct opening up into the fourth ventricle. A little space in the area of the brainstem, little open space called the fourth ventricle, coming from the cerebral aqueduct. Remember, an aqueduct is a waterway. It's a structure that carries water from one place to another. Well, the cerebral aqueduct carries fluid, cerebral spinal fluid, throughout the brain from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. Now, where is, I mentioned cerebral spinal fluid. Where is cerebrospinal fluid created? It's created in a place called the choroid plexus. A little structure. Where is it? In this area, right here. It's the choroid plexus. Is an area where cerebrospinal fluid is created and secreted into the ventricular system. And that concludes the cavities and coverings, the ventricles of the brain, sort of open spaces. I am Dr. Stephen Harkins. Until next time.